I've had, like a lot of people, sort of a love-hate relationship with church for almost as long as I can remember. What I've always loved has been the sense of connection and community that church can bring. Being raised in a small town United Methodist Church in West Virginia, my formative relationships and some friendships that still endure today were born out of that fellowship. But my feelings about church as an institution have been almost uniformly negative. My childhood memories of church services are all associated with boredom at best and traumatizing fear at worst. And the message of Christianity as a behavior management kind of program just never made a lot of sense to me. So like many people in my generation, I walked away from church in my 20s only to wander back in when family and fatherhood began to change my perspectives and priorities. I still loved the community, but I was still bored, and the behavior management paradigm was still a huge turnoff. But somewhere in the midst of all of that, a spark was lit, an idea that things could be different, better, less traumatizing, and more true. So in 2014, a group of friends and I launched a pub theology group called New Wineskins at a local brew pub. And at first, it was basically just a discussion group. People really seemed to like the idea of sitting around, drinking beer, and talking about Jesus. Imagine that. It certainly wasn't a new idea. Pub church types of groups had been emerging for a decade or more. But in the context of semi-rural Appalachia where I live, it was fairly groundbreaking. It didn't take long to discover that there was a hunger in our area for something that the institutional church wasn't offering. A space to ask hard questions, to speak without fear of judgment or intimidation, and to know that people weren't alone in their doubts about faith and their distrust of the church. As time went on, I found myself in conversation after conversation with people who, either through trauma or neglect or just sheer boredom, had lost faith in the church and its dogmas and doctrines, but seemed to know or somehow instinctively guess that there was something good and true about Jesus. These people, these spiritual exiles, as I've come to call them, were my people. I knew their stories were true because their stories were my story. Over time, I kept hearing from people looking for the kind of space that we were creating at New Wineskins. People who were sick of church, but still really interested in Jesus. And while some of those folks lived in my area and could join our group, a lot of them were people that I met in other places, including people that I met online. And it seemed like there had to be a way to connect all of these folks together. But there were still a couple of missing pieces to the puzzle. The first piece was really just learning that online community is real community, that online community was every bit as legitimate as physical community, and that online communities are bound together not by proximity, but by context. Online communities are bound not by proximity, but by context. But the second piece of the puzzle, and the one that really sort of coalesced the larger vision, was revealed to me by, of all things, a tomato plant. You see, I used to keep this little herb garden in a piece of our front yard landscaping where I grew basil and thyme and oregano and hot peppers and cherry tomatoes. Basically, it was a little salsa garden. Now, I'm not really much of a gardener. I'm not good at weeding and pruning and all of the things that you need to do to grow things successfully. So after keeping this little garden for a couple of years, by the fall of 2017, it had just become this tangled up mess. So I decided to dig it all up and start again the following spring. But for the next 2 years, my herb garden was nothing more than a weed bed. Even commercial weed killer couldn't keep it under control. And so by June of 2019, I was so tired of fighting with these weeds that I dug it all up again with the intent of at least throwing down some mulch to hold me over till the next growing season. So when I looked out my kitchen window one day and saw this little green sprout poking up through the dirt, I threw up my hands in surrender and went out to pluck it before it could grow and spread. But to my surprise, it wasn't a weed. There coming up from the dirt, despite nearly 2 years of neglect and outright assault, a tomato plant was beginning to grow. And with it, this metaphor began to take shape that started to clarify the vision that I'd been chasing. My little accidental tomato became a symbol for all of those people who've been neglected and in many cases outright assaulted by the institutional church. And yet, despite all of that, insisted that they had value and life and worth. God sows seeds in all kinds of places. So New Wineskins had already demonstrated a desire for a different kind of faith community, a church, if you will, for people who hate church. The idea of contextual online communities showed that it was possible to connect people around ideas and content rather than just location. And finally, my little accidental tomatoes gave me an idea for how to create and curate the kind of content around which spiritual exiles like me could find each other and grow beyond the walls and fences of institutional Christianity. So I launched the Accidental Tomatoes podcast in 2019 to provide the kind of content alongside a weekly blog that I had relaunched earlier that year to connect people with. At the same time, New Wineskins moved from being just kind of a side hustle to my primary ministry appointment. Still, though, it was these two separate streams that I knew I needed to find a way to merge together. Content creation on the one hand and community formation on the other. And then the pandemic hit. And when New Wineskins was forced to move online and using Zoom to maintain our conversation-based format, the pieces finally started to come together. As content was more and more driving our conversations, we found ourselves evolving from a discussion group into a whole new kind of worshiping community. And through a process that was so organic as to be almost unnoticeable, we were beginning to reshape our very theology of worship. Rather than seeing worship as something to be consumed or to participate in more or less passively, we learned that dialogue is worship. That the conversations we were having were not just helpful, they were holy. And what we're now starting to see is the possibility that this whole idea of creating community around content and conversation could serve as a model, not in a formulaic cookie cutter kind of way, but in a way that's contextual and organic. And if we can create contextual communities that are not just formed out of our traditional molds and paradigms of coercing people back into the institution, maybe we can find whole new ways to inspire and empower people into an authentic and transformational experience of the divine. Now, if all of this resonates with you in some way, let me just ask you to consider a few things. Who are the spiritual exiles in your orbit? And what kinds of specific contexts or shared experiences might be connecting points for them? What kind of content, either created or curated, can form the basis for building a new kind of faith community within those connecting contexts? Music, visual arts, literature? Are there ideas that you're already having about post-COVID community that could be repurposed to include the spiritual exiles in your world? Can your online presence stretch beyond your institutional paradigms? See, I think we all recognize that while the church is still and always will be the body of Christ in the world, our institutional ideas about what constitutes church are changing rapidly. And those of us who identify as spiritual exiles are beginning to find new expressions of community that are no less the body of Christ than our traditional congregations. They just don't always fit the mold. And right now might be the time, in the midst of both social and ecclesiological crisis, to start imagining all the various and amazing ways that can look.